Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with David Ryden, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Houston downtown. Dr. Ryden will be sharing his expertise on Missions in Jamaica, as he has researched this subject for several years and offers gems on understanding these documents. The article Manumission in the late 18th century Jamaica, written by the professor, will be linked in the show notes. And without further ado, let's have a listen to the discussion. Thank you so much, David, for coming on to the podcast, to take your time out of your day to start speaking about, Manumissions, in particular Jamaica, in terms of where Manumissions were used to free the enslaved, and of course to discuss, all of those details as to why that would have been used. And, we'll start with, how or what exactly defining these Manumissions, if you could.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you, Wendy, for having me. This is terrific. It's a great opportunity. I don't get many calls where people are interested in something I've worked on. So it's a pretty narrow field, but I think it's one that genealogists would really be interested in. Yes. Manumissions are, they're more, they happen in nearly all slave societies, particularly urban slave societies, going way back to ancient Rome. But you see the same in Latin America, as well as English America, as well as French America. So into the early modern period, you'd see examples of manumission. And what it basically is it describes the process in which an individual slave owner would free his or her enslaved either men, women, or children. And it was, I guess, voluntary. I think that's the key term. So it's not emancipation or forced manumission, but rather these are voluntary manumissions. And sometimes to a modern reader, or oftentimes to a modern reader, they're quite surprised to see that this ever happened, that there was examples in which a master would feel compelled for one reason or another to free his or her slaves. Rarely did you ever see anybody free all of their slaves.
Yes.
An example, though, would be, say, the Quakers in different parts of the Atlantic world, but in Pennsylvania, there was this movement right around the 1760s, 1770s, in which people basically divested themselves from slavery for moral reasons. I haven't seen that in Jamaica in any of the records I've looked at. There's no misgiving about, in the actual deeds about the institution of slavery itself. There are other reasons that these masters manumitted their slaves.
No, you're right. Because it's just very interesting when you do look at these documents and how, as a researcher in genealogy, how it connects to the family and how certain things have come about because of it. And would you say that for these types of documents that this is like a primary or a secondary document that someone would be looking at?
Well, these are, as far as what historians call primary sources, it's any source that was basically created during the period in which we're studying. So these are all primary sources. They're all not only primary sources, but they're manuscript sources. Some of these, and I guess I could, I'm a little bit, whether I should be talking about the sources at this point or we can talk about them in more detail, but they were very important records, you can imagine. They were basically a property as far as the law was concerned. The law had this legal fiction that people were property, or to be even more specific, that they were chattel, meaning movable property. And so these were so the law pretended or constructed this idea that enslaved people were indeed property, even though the reality was far different. And masters knew that. There's all these logical inconsistencies. For example, enslaved people seem to have property and sometimes bought their own freedom. Well, how could a piece of property have the property buy his or her own freedom? But nonetheless, these documents are kind of written as a contract, as a property transaction, and so they're very important primary sources, and they were important, obviously, to the people whose freedom depended upon them, and they were ultimately filed in the island record office to the secretary's office right there in King Square in Spanish Town. And there are something like 60 of these volumes of these Manumission deeds. So they're really remarkable. Some of them have been recopied. If you look at the back of them, if you ever have an opportunity to either go online and look at the volumes, some of the last page, it will describe that these are either originals or it's a sign or copies of the originals. And so for some, I guess my assumption is that the materials were degrading. And so the record office basically was called upon by the assembly to basically make sure the records were being maintained well. And some of it had to be recopied by hand. So we've got really remarkable. And it's really remarkable that this was done after slavery. That's how important these documents continue to be. So, yeah.
Yeah, they're very vital. And I know that you just talked on in terms of, why these types were used, because, this discussion is primarily based off of your article, Manumissions in Late 18th Century Jamaica. So if you can just be able to go into why these manumissions would be used and the examples for that.
Sure. So there could be a number of reasons why a master, he or she, would free his or her slaves. So I'm going to give the basic version. Yep. And maybe as we discuss things, we'll find more complex examples. That's kind of how I structured the article.
Yeah.
That I suppose there are examples in which enslaved people were freed for payment. So this payment came, and oftentimes we're unsure where that payment actually originated from. I sort of, just based on a sample, I looked at one volume 11, and had just over 300 manumission deeds. About 30% of those records involved a bona fide payment. What I mean by a bona fide payment, a substantial amount of money. The amount of money that, and I hate to, be so crass about it, but the amount of the people would be sort of worth if they were sold. So these were compensating the master for his or her loss of property. So about 30% of the records involve payment. It's always ambiguous, and we can discuss when we look at the actual deed where that money is actually coming from. We can only speculate. And then about 20%, there was no payment listed. And then about 50% of them, there was just a token exchange of 10 shillings per person, usually. That was sort of the standard. And I think that gets back to my original point, that these were viewed as kind of property transactions. And in fact, if you look in some of the Lesser Antilles, some of the smaller islands, manumission deeds are oftentimes filed in with land transactions. And the structure of the deeds look a lot like land transaction deeds. They also look like marriage settlement deeds that were when very wealthy people married one another. Sometimes they established who's it's almost like a prenup. and it has some of the same language. But if you were to sort of Google around some of the phrases, you'll see wherever the English were sort of pops up. In India, it pops up examples of these legal phrases. I mean, that's what we're looking at. The English legalese is what I should probably say. So there was the other half of the manumission deeds that I looked at were gratis manumissions. So there was no sort of clear money changing hands. But sometimes these deeds, believe it or not, they'll say, the master will say, he is freeing the individuals listed for love and affection.
Yes.
So you'll see there is this family connection, which was much more open in Jamaica than, say, British North America. So British North America, there wasn't much recognition of children, at least formally. Obviously, for those of you who know anything about the United States, there's a great deal of taboo, at least in what was voiced amongst white society anyway. So there's also examples of reward for hard work, and loyalty. So that's sometimes listed. Sometimes both of those phrases are combined in a last will and testament. And the way that worked is the last will and testament would be, I suppose, a separate document from these manumission deeds. The will would tell the executor that he or she must draw up a manumission deed, and then that manumission deed would ultimately be filed in the colonial office, in the colonial secretary's office. And there was one example in the 300 or so deeds that I looked at where a woman or a widow who was freeing a slave actually didn't do it on the spot, but said after my death. So it's the only example I've seen of a sort of a forward at some point in time in the future. And I just speculate that maybe that was done in order to really assure the enslaved individual that she would be freed at some point in time once the death, whereas a will could be just changed at any point, right? It's a little less, so it's a little more tentative. So I thought that was just an interesting case, if nothing else. And then last, sometimes service to the colony. And this is an awkward thing to talk about, but if an enslaved person provided some kind of essential service in the defense of the colony from foreign invasion, or even more troubling, revealing a slave conspiracy. So there are examples, and you can find statutes in the assembly records that would free individual slaves for the service they had done to basically the master class in maintaining white power on the island. And so you find in these manumission deeds every once in a while, the governor is actually doing the manumitting. So it's a very strange that that's how important these deeds were. They had to be sort of formally gone through the process. And there were, as we'll see maybe soon enough, that there are a number of people involved to give legitimacy to the deed. For example, witnesses, the manumitter, and so forth. So those are sort of the basic, I suppose, examples, but there are some unexpected ones that you find sometimes. For example, they oftentimes, as we'll see, they'll identify what the phenotype of the manumitter is if they're not white. And so sometimes you see people of color freeing slaves, and some of them might indeed have been bona fide slave owners. I mean, there's examples of that, but I suspect most of these that I describe in my article anyway, or that I've looked at, were free people of color purchasing their loved ones and being just basically in law slave owners, but actually just going through the process of purchasing their friends or families and then manumitting them with the express purpose of manumitting. It's almost giving one more layer I suppose, legal defense, right? That you
Yes.
are indeed freed if you have one of these records. You've got the sales bill and so forth. So we can only speculate with a lot of these, I guess, theories. I'm speculating at this point
Yes.
because they're frustratingly thin, some of the deeds. So, yeah.
Yes, but they're very interesting documents to look at.
You're right.
And when I, had the opportunity to look at a few of them based on just as what you had said in terms of a will giving direction to the executor or the executrix to be able to say to free this particular person. So as a genealogist, as a researcher, you follow the bits of crumbs that you get,
Yes.
and you go from the will to now these manumissions, and then you see further layers. And as you said, in terms of the witnesses, sometimes they could have been someone that they were, dealing business with, or very close, some sort of familiar relationships with, right? So, because they tend to be all in the same, I guess, very, close relationships they always had prior to. So that was just interesting to see in those documents. And, we do have an example here, so I'll just share my screen. And then of Elizabeth Edwards
That's right.
to Cujo.
That's right. And that it's really interesting how they and Wendy, you probably, if you look through a bunch of these, you see there's a bit of a rhythm to them. I mean, every once in a while there'll be one that doesn't follow the same legalese. But what we're looking at here on the left is a nice little thumbnail, which sort of identifies the manumitter. In this case, it's Elizabeth Edwards, and it's to Cujo. And I can't remember. I want to say something like 15% or 20% of the manumittees that I looked at had last names. So it's not altogether rare. I mean, it happens. And usually there might be two names given, which is kind of interesting. Like another study could be done on that, showing the Christian name and then otherwise known as, but in this case, it's just Cujo, which is interesting in itself because we have a West African name there, and no alternative names here. It's just Cujo. So I guess if one were to get here to this particular deed, it would probably be through Elizabeth Edwards' name and maybe that particular plantation. Now that follows the one that says 20, is it 26th or 21st? I read it as, or is it 24?
Hold on here.
I thought it was interesting that it's in December because that always makes me think.
It appears to be 24, yeah.
20, yeah, it's an interesting date, isn't it? Now, this would have been, I think, my understanding after looking through these is that's the date it was actually brought to the island secretary's office. So it's not necessarily the date of the Manumission. In fact, I saw one that was over a decade between the Manumission date and the date, it was from the 1760s, and it appeared in actually the preceding volume of this one is volume 12. So, okay, so there's a bit of a rhythm to it, and if you were to sort of the way, if I could offer any advice to people who are working with these is, I find I'm a pretty good typist, and I kind of found if I type it out, I can sort of follow them, like the logic. You would be surprised how many prepositions there are. There's like of, in, throughout, forevermore.
Yes.
Just sort of, this goes over and over and over. So sometimes I find that helps me understand what's going on in the text, or just somehow to slow my reading down, because it is a bit complicated. But in the first part, it usually will be an introduction in the first person saying, here I am, Elizabeth Edwards. And then it will list the parish she's from. And that's basically, Jamaica in the 18th century had a different set of parish boundaries than presently. But you can find maps that will sort of identify them. But this is, in some ways, being St. Catherine is not surprising. There's it's where Spanish Town is located. So there's a town, and Manumission tends to be an urban phenomenon. It happened throughout the island, in all of the island parishes, but both Kingston and St. Catherine. Basically, that's where the bulk of these manumissions came from, even though they represent a relatively small proportion of the enslaved population, if you follow. So I think other people who've done research on manumission throughout the Atlantic world will often say manumission is an urban phenomenon, generally speaking, not always. And it has to do with the proximity and the closeness of the master and the enslaved. You know, they kind of develop some kind of relationship with one another. Not always, though.
Yes.
But that's quite frequent. So, and then it says the county of Middlesex in the aforesaid, then it says the aforesaid widow. So we've got kind of an occupation, you know, she's a widow. We know where she's from. These are important clues if you're trying to triangulate this. And then the next sentence, it basically says right off the bat, in consideration of a sum of 100 pounds paid by somebody named John Matthews of the parish of St. Catherine. So he lives in the same. Who is this guy, John Matthews? None of us necessarily know. You know, this is where the speculating comes in. And what is his connection? Is he acting as an agent for the person who's enslaved? Maybe he's, or being manumitted. Is he basically taking Cujo's money and acting as a fictional purchaser, you know, to create the legal fiction to make it all work, basically? We're not quite sure. Or is he working for Elizabeth Edwards in this case?
Yes.
We just don't know. We don't know. But somebody's paying real money here. I mean, this is a significant sum of money.
Exactly.
And it identified him as a tailor. And I found that was interesting because Cujo, if you, presence receipt. See, it goes on and on saying that she releases John Taylor, believe it or not, of any future obligations. So she spends a lot of time, and you'll see that in land deed transactions, in English land deed transactions, that the buyer is basically, I'm giving you this money and I don't owe you anything else, and nor do my descendants. So that's what's sort of going on there. But then the important part, I was just trying to scroll down. I think it says, that by these presents, and I should emphasize that because that confused me for a long time. I'm like, what does that presence mean? And I found in a 19th century legal journal is what it means is that by these texts, it's referring to itself. It's a kind of like saying, because for a long time I was like, by these presents, are they talking about the money, like being a present or a gift, or is it a form of presence by the people? But it's actually referring to the text. So it's saying by these texts. So you could say by this contract, I do manumise and franchise and forever set free from all manner of bondage, servitude, and slavery whatsoever a certain Negro man called Cujo, by trade a tailor. Wow. Now, rarely do they tell us the occupation. They usually tell us, again, the phenotypes, that his name's Cujo. He's not of European ancestry at all. Makes you wonder, is he African? You know, that's what.
Yes.
Or you can certainly, you could say at the very least his mother was, right? Or when he was named. But it's interesting that he has the same trade as, I blanked on the guy, John Matthews. They have the same trade. So they know one another, right? And maybe they work together. It's one of those and again, it does suggest there's this closeness between the parties involved, right? That it's not, you know, some of these manumission deeds you'll run into, the planter might be an absentee in London. And I write about that example, sort of the most excruciatingly long distance communications between a person trying to manumit a slave and the owner who's in London. And so they're writing back and forth, you know, trying to negotiate and come up with sort of terms. So that the language of the deeds, sometimes they go over and over saying, I manumise and franchise and forever set free, and none of my children have any claim over this individual in the future. So it's pretty powerful in that way, I think. I was just going to point out just a technical thing. You notice there's a page number in the bottom left,
Yes.
and I don't know if this was the Jamaica archive that later penciled in these numbers, but sometimes that can be helpful if you're a researcher and just trying to, especially if you're now. I think this actual what we're looking at here, I should have mentioned, this is from the British Library's Endangered Archive Project.
Yes.
And they partnered with a number of institutions throughout the world. And I think there's only about 10 or 12 volumes out of the 60 that have been filmed and put up on the British Library website.
Exactly.
So there's 60 of these. So, and of course, as the slave population grows and the rate of manumission, I mean, I estimate based on my sample that in 1774-ish, the early 1770s, it was about 0.75 people per 1,000 were freed. So it's not very frequently on an annual basis. This is on a yearly basis. If you go to places like Kingston, it's a little higher. It's a bit higher. But by the time you get to the 1820s, that figures like 1.5 for the island. So in the 1820s, there's a great deal of I think you'll find an explosion of manumission deeds at that point because the population is probably around 300,000. I should know these things off the back of my hand, but
no,
I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
But just to let you know that there's a lot more records than are on the British Library website. But the British Library started with the first ones, which are in the 1740s. So they go back were there manumissions before the 1740s? Most certainly so. Most certainly so. Were there manumissions made that weren't recorded in these volumes? Probably. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some that didn't ever get registered with the island, but probably pretty small because it was so important to get it signed, sealed, and delivered quite literally with the island. I've read that some of them are in something that's called a toll book. If you ever run into what a toll book on your trip to Jamaica or anything?
I haven't. I haven't.
It's supposed to be something where they record. There were in each parish, and they recorded slave sales supposedly and on these toll books. But I personally have not seen a toll book, and I don't know if they must be somewhere. I don't know if they're in the. I haven't gone down this route exploring. But again, with slave sales, are they going to have first and last name? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be a hard one. So here we'll go to the second page just to kind of finalize.
Wrap this up a little bit. Yeah. So there's some repetition that goes on, and it will give you the exact date. So in this case, she set my hand and seal this 26th day of October in the year of our Lord. So it was actually in October that the manumission took place, but it got processed right before Christmas.
Yes.
And it might have had something to do with Elizabeth was going to Spanish Town at Christmas time, maybe, you see, and maybe that was the day before they were closed for the rest of the week. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
So it could be something like that. That could explain the December 24th date. And then it's signed Elizabeth Edwards, which is useful because you'll see some of these records just signed with a mark. We're talking only about 10% of them, but of course it's higher percentage if you see different, if somebody is female, or a tradesman who's doing the manumitted, or a person of color, they might be simply leaving their mark.
Yes.
More frequently than, of course, a planter who is certainly going to be in the world of literacy. I mean, it's a complex thing. These planters were privileged, but also running a plantation, they had to be able to read legal documents and operate within the capitalist economy, of course. So then the last thing is there'll be a memorandum at the bottom. And the memorandum is basically it's a declaration made by a witness that he observed all this, or she observed all this. And so there'll be another first name and last name. And then there'll be somebody important, like here, it was somebody named Thomas Hersey Barrett. And so it's, you've got a lot of last names here, lots of threads in there. And I think as more and more people digitize these records, we're going to be able to triangulate connections pretty easily, especially with the last names. The only other thing I wanted to add, and I mentioned this to you earlier, I think, is that I just noticed, just serendipitously, I was flipping through them, and I noticed that Brian Edwards was like 3 records before. And Brian Edwards was a very important politician, planter, writer. He wrote a great big volume in the 1790s on Jamaica. A lot of historians use it, rely on Edwards. He was a member of Parliament, so he came and lived as an absentee for a while. So he's definitely part of the Jamaican planting elite. And Elizabeth Edwards, I was just sort of Googling around, and I was like, when I saw this, and his mother was named Elizabeth. So I don't know if this is his mother, sister, not sure, but it's just interesting how you can draw these connections. And I suppose it always, when you sort of go through these records, you start to realize what a small place it was, and how close these connections were, especially amongst the free population of Jamaica. So I think I would suspect that genealogists like yourself are going to be finding all sorts of connections with families. And so so it's the structure of the deed. Did you have any other observations? Or
no, but I mean, what you mentioned is true, is that because it was such a small population, more than likely there was some sort of connections that they had already. And you see that, whether that in this particular document, in the Manumissions, or in the wills, or even in marriage records, right? You're going to see same people, or very similar, signing on certain documents or witnessing certain things on their behalf. And it's just following that, those breadcrumbs and those paperwork.
That's a really good way to phrase it. Yeah, it is like breadcrumbs, isn't it?
And you connect them and you look at them all together and you're like, wow. It's interesting how those connections, how those relationships were bound during that time.
And sometimes what's interesting is if you start with, say, the legislative record, and you look at people being, well, sometimes they wouldn't have been. So maybe this gets us to our next point, right? Which is what happens when people are freed. And
exactly.
Of course, yes. I speculate, obviously everybody wants their freedom. I think that's universal, right? But you would imagine that certain people probably could operate better in freedom than others. That is, Cujo, the tailor, who worked alongside Mitchell, probably could operate in the free world very effectively. Like he could, work as a tailor, have an income, and not be harassed, or, presumably. Someone who had trouble, speaking English. Maybe they're from Africa. You can't imagine in some ways them other than living as Maroons. And I suppose we should have mentioned that there's a whole other class of free people of color, the Maroons, who are runaway slaves, or their ancestors who are runaway slaves living in the interior of Jamaica. So I guess if we're talking about, negotiating through one of these manumission deeds, and that's kind of what it was a negotiation, except for with maybe children, right? But with the adults, who make up almost half of the manumission deeds. It's interesting. You look at the children, and the majority of the children are of mixed race. You look at the adults, and the majority of them are of African descent only.
Yes.
It's interesting that and I suppose some people have suggested, I think the mixed population would have been smaller than you think. Probably be about 10 or 15%, if I'm not, of the whole population, if you see what I'm saying. So, so people of mixed race, I guess it shouldn't, we could probably intuit that they're going to have probably more connections to the free world. I talk about this in my article, that there's some examples where there were the father of children, or the liaisons with white men and women who were enslaved, who were very zealous in trying to get their children or their unequal partner free. But then there are others, many others, who just turn their back. And, some of the abolitionists later on would point that out, and missionaries, that, there's all these children that were kind of left by sort of a revolving door of white workers on these, working for absentees on these plantations. And so there's a range, and you can get maybe a warped vision if you look at these deeds, because you're getting the most zealous, the most committed fathers and of some of those children, and who are actually sometimes paying money, and sometimes paying well over. I gave one example of one of money to free his son. So what was the life for free people of color? And there's a range of experiences, but of course they were generally, a third class or second class citizens or subjects. What happened in the early 1760s is a law was passed. Some recent historians have made this argument that, it's really once you get into the 1760s and the 1770s, you get this kind of hardening of kind of racialized, almost apartheid thinking going on in Jamaica. And so in 1761, there was a law passed limiting the size of, I suppose, estates that could be passed on to free people of color. And it was limited to £1,000 in currency. And so some people have said, aha, see, there's an example. They didn't want. So in the one sense, the plantation oligarchy did not want free people of color to be too rich. But then they complained that they didn't want to see free people of color who would be too poor and be burdens on the community. And so there's plenty of literature being written in the 1770s, at least by Edward Long, who is a well-known planter, writer, author. And he basically expresses this contradictory position, concerned that free people of color are too rich or too poor, if you see what I'm saying, and that they'll be a burden. And so they eventually do pass a statute to try to make provisions, almost to restrict manumission, by saying that the manumitter has to at least provide some kind of guarantee that should that free person not be able to take care of himself or herself, that they won't be a burden on the parish, if you see what I'm saying. And so they would have to put a bond up to have an annuity should the free person be unable to maintain themselves. So sometimes, despite what the law said and despite the attitude you read by Long, there are examples in which free people of color, through statute, through private acts of the assembly, were given now it's the wording's always limited. They say the same rights as freeborn Englishmen, except, and then they don't really say what the exceptions are. And the exceptions, at least my understanding is, they couldn't sit in the assembly or the council or on juries. I think that might have been the limited of their and to be honest, Wendy, I need to do more research on that myself. So, but I do know that was there was this avenue to give free people of color more rights, or more rights than other free people of color who wouldn't be able to. A common complaint in the 19th century was that free people of color could not give testimony against white people, and this is a real big hardship, because of that basically gives all white people the right to do whatever they want, because one who is of color could not sort of testify against the person who assaulted them or treated them poorly. So anyway, so that's sort of the so there's a variety of stories that one can tell and different experiences. There's free people of color who are quite wealthy. There's a guy named Daniel Livesey wrote a book recently, talking about basically people who had African ancestry, but essentially passed as white and were part of the elite. Some elite planters wanted their children to go back to England to go to schools like Eton, for example. And so there's a range of experiences.
No, definitely, because I know definitely from what I have been able to uncover, where at times they were free, like some of my ancestors were free, but then they were, there was a special provisions or law that was passed where they were then deemed to be legally white. So they could, go beyond this particular provision that you mentioned in terms of more than that $2,000 limit, that they could be able to inherit the entire estate.
Yes. Yeah. So it's interesting how the law says one thing, but then there's this powerful men are making sure that they can bend the law, at least through legislation, through these private acts.
Exactly. It was a private act that went through, and it was just interesting to know that that people of color could then be deemed as legally white and have the same provisions.
Yeah, I mentioned only briefly this a gentleman named Dougal Clark, who apparently was an engineer who was a skilled, I suppose, designer. I'm not sure exactly what he designed, but I found him as one of the sponsors, and it listed his occupation. It listed the right parish that he lived in, and it didn't identify him as a person of color. It did. So
interesting.
And maybe there's two Dougal Clarks, and maybe I got it wrong, but it's about the same time he received one of those private acts.
Yeah.
So I think even on paper that colorism almost disappears. I think more research needs to be done on that. I only have one case, where I ran into that, but it made me think, wow, I wonder, there's a lot to learn from these, it's, you would think you have something concrete when you have a primary legal document, but there's so many rooms for speculation and
avenues to go down.
That's right.
And to kind of tie, again, it's basically tying everything together, from what you're uncovering. So, with these manumissions, I take it they were used as a tool by the government. Can you just kind of go a little bit into that as well?
Well, I was thinking primarily in order to keep the slave population divided amongst themselves. Yes. And this is just a sort of a macro strategy that was used on a micro scale on the plantation, this dividing and conquering. And oftentimes people naively ask and wonder, like, well, how in the world did, a population that represented about 10% control 90%, right? How did the white, and especially when you go into the countryside, it was far sort of, the ratio is even more skewed towards those who were enslaved. And I think, and of course this might be controversial, but I think it had to do with just the structure of the plantation, in which you had, particularly for men, opportunities for, I'll put it in quotes, for social advancement. Planters were very careful to sort of move men in particular out of the field positions and move them into skilled positions like driver or boiler man, or and to a certain degree, of course, mixed race males found, they were moved into domestics or moved in these more skilled areas than those who were not. So that's like constant division going on. In isolation too. I think the plantation probably worked pretty hard at keeping them isolated, but I think this whole idea of, it's almost a macro level where the assembly rewards individuals with their freedom. That's like the ultimate, isn't it? For basically turning on other enslaved people and revealing conspiracies. And there was the Tackies revolt in the beginning of the 1760s. You will see there's a whole series of them in the 1760s of freedom being granted to individuals who helped basically the colonial power to crush the rebellion and to stomp down any additional uprisings that happened in the 1760s. In fact, that's one of the arguments that Trevor Bernard makes, is that some of that racism or hardening of racism, and I know that sounds weird because you'd think, well, wasn't it very racist, slavery from the get-go? And some historians sort of point to this increasing formalization that's going on, like the limiting of inheritance, for example, that we talked about. That and when you read Edward Long, he's got these vile racist ideas that he articulates. Like it's really the first time it really is articulated, and some people say it's the result of that uprising, or at least that's what Bernard suggests, at least in one or two of his books. So and I think it's a compelling argument.
Definitely so. It goes to the whole, I guess, the power dynamic for them to use, this as a tool to be able to kind of control, or, as you said, to potentially that somebody could get, their freedom.
Yeah. And I mean, it's obviously that I really like working with these documents for many reasons, but one of them is they can be depressing because, but they're also, the idea that people are gaining their freedom. It's like a snapshot of, I suppose, something that we should all appreciate, I suppose, now looking back. It's very easy to sort of look at the past as this monolithic, I suppose, I suppose almost reduce it to a cartoon system of slavery in society, and almost take agency away from people of color and say it's all master power. And then when you read enough of these, you start to see the humanity come out. For example, Cujo, I know it sounds small, but him having an occupation and a connection with John Mitchell, and how is he sort of navigating? I mean, he is doing some active work in getting his own freedom and living after slavery and as a free man. when you get to the 1820s, there's more examples of the free population of color working together to fight racism and to end slavery. But when you go to the 18th century, you got to look for scraps such as these important deeds, and you can see why they've preserved them. Were very important to the people who were involved.
Yeah, no, they absolutely were, and it's harder to get more information from this time frame period. So anything that a genealogist can get their hands on is great during this particular time frame period. And what would you, I guess, just to wrap this up, and kind of what would be your final thoughts in terms of with these particular manumissions in Jamaica?
Well, I think just you inviting me has sparked something that's always been in the back of my head. Every once in a while, when you're in the Jamaica archives, you run into genealogists, and it's really neat that we've got the internet and there are so many people working together now. And I can't how how often like I'll stumble on something that's really useful, important, whether it's for teaching in class or in my own research. So I thank you and all the genealogists for all the work you all are doing and using the internet for good use. But as far as these manumission deeds are concerned, they really are. They have an addictive quality to them. I mean, I started working on this as almost a side project back in the 1990s, and I restarted the project after I saw they were up online again. And even I think anybody who's interested in the history of slavery or 18th century Jamaica could learn a lot just sort of flipping through them. There's a like I said, there's a little bit of a pattern into the logic, but you can find some interesting stories. And I use it with my students. We use these records and have them sort of do a little project where they work together and try to unpack them and maybe code up 10 or 20 of them as a group. And that's kind of a neat project. And so, even if you're not finding a connection to your own family history, I think they tell us a lot about Jamaica.
Yes, definitely during that time. And, it's, I just definitely want to thank you so much because, I mean, when I first came across these records, I didn't know what they were. I was just excited to be able to find, my family member in some of these documents, but not really understanding the gravity of what these records actually represented for that particular time frame period. And some of the points that you say is on point in terms of that this is the time during this particular time, during slavery, during the fact that people were able to kind of find a way to be able to gain their freedom. And it just shows in terms of the relationships that were built and how things really, it's not so much as cut and dry or black and white. It's just there was a lot of gray in between for some people.
Certainly, and a lot of like I said, agency or people making, working through their lives. So I want to thank you. This has been really nice experience for me. I haven't had anybody actually say, "Hey, you want to be on my podcast?" So I really thank you for this opportunity, Wendy.
No, thank you, David. I thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.